and welcome to this episode of the Center for Audit Quality's Profession in Focus. My name is Julie Bell Lindsay, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Audit Quality. I am very pleased to welcome our guest today, the Director of the Division of Corporation Finance at the Securities and Exchange Commission, Mr. Bill Hinman. Bill, welcome.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks so much for having me here today. I really enjoy our discussions over the past few months around what's going on, and I know we'll have a good dialogue today. Before we get started, I'd like to just mention that the comments I'll make are my own. They don't reflect the views necessarily of the staff or of members of the SEC's, both commissioners or the chairman. So these are my own thoughts, and I'm looking forward to sharing them. So thank you very much.
Well, let's dive right in. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Commission as a whole has been very proactive in issuing statements and other guidance relating to disclosure issues and other reporting issues resulting from the pandemic. This included in particular in early April a joint statement by you and Chair Clayton regarding and encouraging companies to consider forward-looking information, recognizing that in this environment, historical information may not be as significant. Can you comment on what prompted you to issue that guidance?
Sure, and thanks for that question. You're right, very early on, following the advent of the COVID crisis and folks starting to go home and telework and companies looking at the close of Q1 in that environment, we thought it would be useful to provide some guidance and some hopefully helpful relief, or at least specific guidance on how to approach the quarter end with COVID restraints on the close. So one of the things we wanted to emphasize was forward-looking information, as you mentioned, but we also were very cognizant from talking to law firms, accounting firms, people like yourself, I think you and I chatted about this, that there would be, additional challenges to the close. It was coming, these challenges were coming late in the quarter. People were going to have to think about impairment issues in particular. A lot of people thinking about impairment issues at once meant there was going to be a lot of strain on getting consultants who were going to be working from home. So we're trying to think about how to help people, deal with that, at the same time put out useful information. The chairman and I put out a statement that did say, in times like this, being timely in your reporting, as timely as you can be, and being as forward-looking as you can be, will be incredibly useful. One of the things that I think we appreciate is that the market really looks to SEC disclosures to get a sense not just of how a particular company is doing, but how the economy is doing. SEC disclosures carry with them liability, and they are carefully vetted by every company that makes them. So when people read those disclosures, I think they have a certain confidence in them that may be different than what they hear when people are speaking to the press or just speaking off the cuff. These are high integrity comments, and I think people use them as they not only think about making investment decisions, but also as they think about where's the economy going, how are my suppliers doing, how are my customers doing that may be reporting companies. So these are critical disclosures, and we wanted to provide as much guidance as we could as to how to put those together for Q1.
And I know as part of that guidance, you and the chair noted that I think it was good faith estimates provided by management and companies. As long as they were good faith estimates, they would not be questioned. Can you comment on that in particular, and how will management and companies know, what good faith estimates look like?
Right. As we try to encourage people to put out forward-looking information and to describe how they were thinking about dealing with the COVID impact on the economy and their business, we did try to give some comfort that forward-looking statements made in good faith wouldn't be second-guessed. And of course, we got a number of questions around, well, how do we know? And you just repeated the question, how do we know if something is being made in good faith, or how will you at the SEC know if you decide to look into some of these disclosures? And the key thing that we tried to emphasize in the statement and after in speeches was consistency. Are you saying the same things in your SEC filings as you are saying to your analyst community, to your vendors, in your press releases, when you're looking for concessions from a supplier or from a landlord, are you describing things in the same way as you have described them in your SEC filings? Are the things that you're saying in the SEC filing consistent with how you're managing the business with your board and the things you're saying in the boardroom? So if we were to look into this, we would look for that consistency, and hopefully we would find it. The other thing we did, and that you mentioned very quickly, is we recognized that Q1 was coming up quickly at the for many folks when we first put out our statement, and we wanted them to do earnings calls and to do a Q if possible on time. And we mentioned on the earnings call, you may not yet have fully closed the books. If you need to provide disclosures that provide a range on the top line or the bottom line, and you want to talk about non-GAAP numbers on that call in the way you normally would, we would be okay with that. But you would still have to reconcile those non-GAAP numbers to the range instead of a point number. People have done that in other contexts. We just wanted to remind people that we're okay with that, and that tool could be used, and we did see some companies doing that.
That's really helpful background and thoughts on that particular issue. Let's drill down a little bit more on some specific guidance that the Division of Corporation Finance has issued, and I'm referring to topics 9 and 9A. Those topics provided some really helpful disclosures to, or guidance to, companies and auditors around just kind of the impacts the pandemic was having on business and other market disruptions and disclosure considerations. Can you comment on what the SEC staff has been observing with respect to company disclosures in the wake of those two issuances of disclosure guidance?
Sure. And you're right. Again, we did put out a couple of pieces. Disclosure guidance topic 9. It turned out to be our 9th disclosure guidance topic. So it just got named number 9. And then because it was so closely related, we put out a second guidance topic 9A. 9 was really done in anticipation of Q1, and 9A was issued as we are approaching the close of Q2. Between the two, 9A was 9 was a more general piece that focused on the kinds of things we thought companies should think about as they were crafting disclosure. We had looked, by the time that disclosure guidance came out, already at a number of filings and 8Ks, and we were getting a sense for how people are being impacted. And we kind of do this in a lot of the guidance that we put out. We look at what issuers are saying. We try to see best examples. We see the kinds of issues they're highlighting. And we try to remind everyone these are the things to be considering. So topic 9 went through a number of sort of general things to think about, including human resource issues. 9A, as we were looking at the close of Q2, came out in an environment where we had seen companies really focused on liquidity and either raising capital. We had record levels of capital being raised in Q2. People were raising capital to sort of weather the storm. People were doing a lot of cost-cutting measures in terms of layoffs, executive pay cuts, closing different facilities. All of it seemed to be very motivated by let's husband the cash and see how we can weather this storm and get through it. We wanted to really focus on that in 9A and highlighted how important the discussions of liquidity would be. We totally recognize that everyone is sort of struggling on how long will this last? How long, how many quarters of cash do we need as our revenues are maybe compromised? We did see people put together, I think, a pretty good array of things that they were considering. Pretty good disclosures around how long they thought their cash would last. And if they didn't give a particular point estimate, which is pretty hard to do in this environment, they at least gave the building blocks of, here's the amount of cash we're burning through, here's what we're experiencing in revenue. And analysts and others could kind of put that together and think about, well, if I assume COVID's going to last through Q2 of 2021, this company will be fine. If it goes beyond that, it's going to start to be strained. They're going to have to raise additional money. It's going to have an impact on the business. So we saw disclosures that help people go through that kind of analysis. And we thought it was a good response. And I think, interestingly, in Q2, we did not extend the filing deadlines. We had done that where people needed to do that in Q1. In Q2, again, talking to folks like yourself and people in the reporting community, we decided that people had sort of figured out how to do a close remotely, and they could do it on time. And we've seen, really no more than the ordinary delays in filings. And I think we got a good set of disclosures as a result of the guidance, and people working really hard to do a close and to do reporting from home.
That's really some really helpful observations there, Bill. I'm going to ask the question, you may not be able to answer it, but is the division considering any additional guidance, particularly as we go into the end of the year, which is for many companies, the end of their fiscal year?
Well, we certainly are available and are fielding questions that are a little bit more technical and a little bit more one-off, every day, really. Things related to executive comp disclosures, and are certain disclosures that are, certain perquisites that are provided to executives going to raise compensation issues and perk disclosure, things of that sort. A lot of those we've been handling on a case-by-case basis. We may do a little bit on the topic I just mentioned through a CNDI. But in terms of another large disclosure guidance topic, at the moment, we don't see the need to do that. We're in the middle of the speaking season, so a lot of us are going to be out there talking about year-end disclosures, and if we feel like there's certain issues, we can highlight them in that context. But right now, there's not a disclosure guidance topic 10 in the works.
Great, thank you very much for that. You touched on this a little bit earlier, and that was non-GAAP measures. And the SEC generally, and the division in particular, has long been focused on non-GAAP measures, and certainly in the COVID pandemic environment. And I believe that was the topic, or it was covered in topic 9. Has the staff seen any disclosures or practices around the use of non-GAAP measures during the pandemic season or during this time that have been concerning to you?
Well, to set the table a little bit, we've seen a range of non-GAAP disclosures that mention COVID items. And as is the case with a lot of non-GAAP disclosures, some are fine and some start to push the envelope. The general principle we have, or one of the general principles we generally have when we look at non-GAAP disclosures is this something the company is actually using itself to manage itself or its relationships with its lenders and others? Or is this something that's intended more or less to put a rosier picture on the quarter end? Obviously, the latter are of concern. And what we've seen in the COVID area, to go back to that, is there are some things that make a lot of sense to sort of parse out and can lend themselves to non-GAAP disclosures. Things like the impact of hazard pay or additional cleaning expenses, supply chain disruptions that required the use of airlines instead of rail transit and things of that sort. If you can identify those and highlight that these are things that are affecting margins and affecting the business, and put that in a non-GAAP number that gets reconciled to the GAAP numbers, we don't have any trouble with that at all. In fact, we would expect people to be thinking along those lines, and it's probably useful disclosure. If people are going to try to provide disclosures that add back in revenue that might have been lost because they were closed, or get to a very hypothetical sort of situation that didn't exist, we think those are really the kinds of things that people are just trying to put a little better spin on things. Adding back revenue that was lost due to COVID is a very subjective, difficult process to go through. Who knows where you would have been, and it's very difficult to associate the expenses and to take those into account too if you're starting to add back revenue. If you want to talk about the impact of shutdowns on revenue, there's ways to do that without putting those numbers into something that has the importance of a non-GAAP metric that is broken out separately, because we think in that area that's just a little too hypothetical. So we've been discouraging that kind of disclosure and encouraging the breaking out of some of the special expenses, because we think that's useful for people to see.
Well, all of that is very understandable, given some of the examples that you provided. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about ESG. Earlier this year, the SEC Investor Advisory Committee provided some recommendations to the Commission, specifically calling for the Commission to begin in earnest a review of the disclosure requirements around material ESG factors. And, COVID has certainly heightened the awareness and focus on things like work environments, human capital, kind of the S, so to speak, in ESG. And I know just last month, the Commission finalized some rules relating to some of your key disclosure requirements. And that included a new requirement around disclosure of human capital issues. Can you comment on those new disclosure requirements specific to human capital?
Sure, happy to. And you're referring to some of the SK changes that we've made recently, and specifically item 101 of SK, which now has a section where we're talking about human capital metrics that might be material. Before I get into some of the details of that, let me just say in general on the ESG, call for more disclosure in the ESG space. What we've been trying to do is to relate various ESG issues to our current disclosure requirements. So, our disclosure system is built on largely on a principles-based rather than a prescriptive approach to disclosure. So, looking at what may be material in any particular area to financial results and future results, as opposed to a check the box, tell us X number of people that you have here, or Y amount of this particular type of CO2 emissions that you may have. We've been trying to tie the ESG items to things that are just material to that particular business. We don't think a one-size prescriptive approach necessarily works very well. The flexibility of the principles-based approach allows us to highlight for issuers in these disclosure guidance topics and elsewhere, when is cybersecurity going to be material to you? And here are the 5 things in our rule base that may require some disclosure of cyber risk or environmental risk or climate change risk. And we've done that. We have climate change guidance out there. We have cyber guidance out there. We think this flexibility is useful, and it generates good disclosure, and it allows the private sector to continue to sort out what metrics they want, have those discussions with issuers. For us to interject ourselves in that, to jump in as they're still sorting that out, I think would be premature. Getting back to 101, 101 is the description of the company's business, and what was drafted a long time ago when property, plant, and equipment was probably one of the more critical resources, and human capital was less important than it is today. In revising 101, we took a principles-based approach, and we said, here are a number of things that people may find material about the description of your business, including things in the human capital resource area. Human capital resources are material to many companies, so think about the metrics that management uses in the human capital space. To the extent those metrics are material and are used to manage the business, they should be shared. And so, for the first time, we kind of broke out human capital as an item that people need to consider, and when they are using those metrics in that space and their material to investors, we expect them to be disclosed.
That's very helpful, and not to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like that any additional actions the Commission may be considering with respect to the investor advisory group's recommendations around kind of the other aspects, the E and the G, would probably fall along the lines of the principles-based approach. Is that a fair assessment?
Exactly. I think, as I just was talking about, we think the flexibility inherent in that approach is useful. I talk to my colleagues around the globe around some of these issues, and there are different approaches in different areas. And one of the things they always remind me of, I've been reminded of by them, is that in these prescriptive disclosures, it often becomes a sort of a check the box in the drafting session. Have we covered this? Have we covered that? And there's not as deep a discussion as they have when they're drafting documents for our system, where they have to think about materiality and think about these issues broadly and about how they apply to a specific company and what's going to be relevant to its business. And we have been hearing that that is actually a process that can generate a higher quality of disclosure that's more directly relevant, and things aren't there just because they were on some laundry list. They're there because counsel and the company and the accountants have all thought through what's material about cybersecurity or climate change or human capital for that particular company. So you're absolutely right. As we go forward here and continue to revise the rule base, that will be the approach.
Great, thank you for that. Let's switch gears yet again to cover another topic that's been very, very front and center over the course of the summer, and that is, in July, I was pleased to participate in the SEC's Roundtable on emerging markets. And I know, Bill, you actually moderated one of the panels during the course of the day. Many different participants from the reporting ecosystem, exchange representative, investors, companies. It was a very, very full day and very productive day. From your perspective, what were some of the key takeaways from that roundtable? And I also know that in early August, the President's Working Group issued some recommendations relating to issues relating to investing in the emerging markets. And, we're, I think, primarily talking about China here. Can you comment on kind of maybe next steps for the Commission?
Sure. And thanks again, Julie, for doing the roundtable. I thought the roundtable overall was very useful to us at the SEC as we try to sort through these issues, and you gave us some good feedback, so thanks for your participation. As you know from having participated, a big part of the discussion focused on some of the issues that the PCAOB and that we face as the PCAOB reviews audit work, or we look for support for published financials and filings with us. In general, I think everyone recognizes that high quality, reliable financial statements, certainly your group appreciates this as much as anyone. Those items are the bedrock of our financial markets. It starts with the financial statements. If you really want to understand the business, you begin there. And so having confidence that the folks that are filing from emerging jurisdictions where there may be less ability for the regulators to check the audits, or you're doing inspection audits of the type that PCAOB is doing, or for us in our review work to get our hands on work papers or other supporting documents. If that doesn't exist, that sort of shakes people's confidence, and it should shake people's confidence in those financials. And we really can't allow that to happen. I mean, when people buy a security on a US exchange, they expect that the regulators, we and the PCAOB, have access and are doing our job. When we can't, that's a problem. So the PCAOB has for the last over 10 years been seeking to do audits of work papers for auditors that are auditing China companies, China-based companies, and we ourselves have been trying to, in many enforcement actions or other cases, trying to get our hands on financial statements and supporting documents, and sometimes that's more difficult than it should be. PCAOB has stated publicly that they haven't been able to actually complete a satisfactory audit of a firm located in China over the last 13 years. So that's not unsurprisingly, I guess, or unsurprisingly, that issue's gotten not just our focus, the PCAOB's focus, but also people in Congress and the executive branch. The House and the Senate have both passed bills basically saying that if a company's auditor hasn't been inspected in the last 3 years, that company may not be eligible for a listing, or may need to be delisted from a U.S. exchange if it's listed here. Those two bills have passed. They haven't been reconciled. They would need to go through that step and obviously be signed by the president for that to become law, but there's a real chance of that. And at the same time that that's been going on, the president, through his working group, which you mentioned, on financial markets, which is basically the folks from Treasury, the Federal Reserve, CFTC, and ourselves, we're tasked with writing a report on these risks and what could be done and what recommendations we would have. In July, that working group came up with a set of recommendations. I think there are about 5 of them. They all really land at our feet at the SEC. The first one is somewhat similar to the legislation I mentioned. It says that if you haven't had a audit completed in the last few years, you will not be eligible for listing, or you may be delisted. Different from the legislation is a feature in that recommendation that while there is the potential for delisting, there's also an alternative, and the alternative will be an interesting one for us to consider in rulemaking to get public comment on, get your group's comments on. The alternative would be if you can't get audited by someone who's had access, where the PCB's had access to work papers, done an inspection, then you could have your financials co-audited by someone who has. So the concept would be, PwC China hasn't been audited, PwC US has been inspected. They could do a co-audit. They could get themselves comfortable with that, and the markets would have the confidence that a firm that is undergoing periodic inspections is standing behind the financials. Whether someone will want to do that, what steps they would feel they had to take, we'll get a lot of comment, I'm sure, as we start to explore that recommendation. Most of the other recommendations had to deal with more disclosure. Frankly, disclosure on a lot of these risks is actually there now. Investors seem to buy through it and are not as troubled by it as we might expect. But we've been asked to look for issuers at enhanced disclosures on some of the risks of this lack of access and oversight. In the fund area, there's also a recommendation that there be more fund disclosure about these risks. Similarly, in the index space, recommendation that funds that use indexes or track indexes should do more diligence about the composition of the index and what work the index itself has done about the underlying market environment. And then finally, more guidance for investment advisors on how they talk to their clients about these risks and make them aware of these risks. But that's the working group set of recommendations. Again, we've been really tasked with trying to think of how all those would be implemented, and then of course we're monitoring the legislation.
It's really helpful that you mentioned the co-audit recommendation, which is one of the first recommendations. We have certainly heard some concerns about the workability of that particular recommendation, particularly because I believe it's premised on the non-cooperating jurisdiction, in this case China, really changing its protocols with respect to work papers. But it sounds like, based on your remarks, that just like the chair has stated, Chair Clayton has stated publicly, the staff is working on proposals or recommendations to follow up on the President's working group recommendations for consideration. And I certainly do believe the Center for Audit Quality will be participating in any comment process on that.
Well, that's good to hear. I think we will benefit greatly from practitioners and groups like yours giving us a better sense of how a co-audit might be done, some of the issues there. The chairman and all the division heads that are affected by this, including myself, have put out a statement describing that we would be trying to come up with rules and guidance that is responsive to the working group's recommendations. So we will be definitely seeking yours and others' input and encourage that. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Bill. We've come to the end. I'm sure we could talk much longer, but I just want to thank you again for your insights and comments today. Thank you for being with us.
Well, Julie, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it, and thanks for all the great questions. Looking forward to your input on a lot of the topics that we just discussed, so thanks very much.